First thing I ran into, when you get your pieces out of the kit, you want to take each and every one, and this is tedious, you want to match them up and make sure the notches line up, because I guarantee you there'll be a few pieces in there that won't line up. And if you get one of those into your hatch, you're going to have a problem. So I checked all these out, made sure they line up. I started this at home because it can be kind of interesting to start it out. You want to get 2 or 3 pieces at each end to get your basic form going. Then you just take these pieces and add them in one at a time. It's real easy to do. I probably don't have enough here to do an entire hatch, so this is scrap I had left over out of the surprise. So you want to get these put in so that they match up like that.
Good Lord.
This works really well if you start that out, like I say, with 2 or 3 pieces on each end, and go ahead and glue it and let it sit overnight so that you have a solid form to work with. If you're trying to do this when the pieces are loose, it's not going to work too well. You get all these pieces put in here like that. You'll have problems with them lining up if you don't check those notches and make sure they're equidistant from one another. When you get all of the pieces seated up, the next question that comes to mind is, how do I make that stay that way? Well, you can't actually just put glue on it very successfully. The method that I taught myself how to do by trial and error, need a little dab of white glue and then go ahead on your joints and paint it over the joints.
From the underside?
Well, I just do it on top. Then after this sets up a little bit, I turn it over and put the other pieces in and do the same thing. I have a lot of luck with this Ambroid Secure It. I also use SIG Super Weld.
What about warpage from the moisture?
You'll get a little of that, but it doesn't really affect this wood that much.
I suppose you could put something heavy on top of it.
Actually, your hatch needs to be a little bit warped anyways to fit the deck.
Yeah. I imagine they warp at sea quite a bit too.
So get that all covered up with glue, and then it can stick to your fingers and everything like it just did. You want to blow the holes out so that you don't create a little window. Anyhow, this is what you end up with the finished product when you get them all put together. This is one I made for the surprise and didn't have to use. It was a leftover piece. You'd think I'd have brought a new bottle of glue with me. Pretty simple process. It looks time consuming, but it's really not. I actually cut all these pieces in less than 30 minutes. Of course, if you're building one of these wooden ships, 30 minutes is nothing to you. Just line those up with the edges of your hatch. If it covers the hole a little bit, no problem. You're not going to see it from the bottom anyway. The whole idea is what it looks like when it's done. You want to do all this at one time so that it all comes together while it's wet. Like you brought up, if you get the glue on the wood, it's not going to stain real good. So that can be an issue that you have to pay attention to.
What would be the feasibility of staining it first?
You can stain the wood first.
And hitting it with a flat or something to dull that off.
You can stain the wood first. For this, I use this 3mm wood. This gives you your outer cover. Put that out at the outside edge. And that's cut with a miter box on the edge. give my wife the new bottle of glue and I end up working with the old one. This is going to be a little bit crude looking, but it'll give you the idea of what you got to do. And if you take a little more time with it, it won't be quite such a problem. This is where you want to be sure you get the glue on the right end. Sometimes if a piece has to go on a specific way.
It's good to know I'm not the only one who ever puts the piece on upside down and backwards.
Now what you want to do after that's done, you can measure the inside dimension of this hole you're trying to fill. I didn't get my pieces cut real well when I was doing them. But you got a 45 millimeters that way and 38 millimeters that way. So if you're doing a grading hat, you can measure that out on here. And I always trim a little bit of these so they're not quite full length. But you can measure that out and mark it with a pencil on there. I don't want to cut this up because I don't want it, this isn't the finished product. But you want to measure your 45 by 38 onto your hatch material. Then you can take your screw cutter. You can take your screw cutters and cut that out one board at a time. You can also do that with a saw. But your saw quite often will tear the wood and make it look ugly. So if you have some nice screw cutters, you can actually cut your hatch out square so that it'll sit right down in there. And just put a little glue around the edge and set it in there. The other thing you can do on a hatch is a solid hatch like you see on my Victory, which I forgot to bring this morning. Of course, this being crosswise is going to be, that's the 38 millimeter. I brought a little scrap wood here to play with. Take a piece of wood and cut it 38 millimeters. I always sand off the ends when I cut them. Make sure it'll fit in there. And then an appropriate dimension for your lifting rings would be approximately 5 millimeters from the end. So center up a mark at 5 millimeters on each end. That's not 5 millimeters. And take the appropriate size drill bit, which usually with this kind of material is going to be like 0.25 or 0.24. Drill a hole in each end. I buy these little bits by the tube because I usually go through a tube or so of them on a ship model. When you break them off though, if you still have a little bit of drill left on the end of the broken part, you can still use it. Almost the entire hull of the Surprise, I drilled the holes in for the nails with the broken drill bit. My floor is carpeted with these things. Open that ring a little bit, slip it in your eyeball.
You mean the carpet monster don't eat those things?
Close it back up. Well, actually, my workroom is a hardwood floor, and the little cracks in there are pretty much filled up with these.
Oh, the crack monster, not the carpet monster.
And then you can stick this through the hole. Now, if this is not going to be visible from the bottom, I will cut it off so that a little bit of it sticks out, and then bend it over. If it's going to be visible, you want to super glue it in there securely and cut it off flush. But then when you put that in both ends, you've got your little hatch board with the lifting ring. Yeah. That explains why I use so many eye bolts and rings. There will be probably 1,000 of these little rings on the Victory. And they give you about 60 of them in the kit. But I do things a little differently. But that's the basic idea of how to do a hatch. This one doesn't look too good.
good.
You don't need the tools that I have. These are all snap-on tools, but your screw cutters and so forth will work just fine. Good pair of needle nose pliers to work with your rings. This is probably already dry enough to where I could go ahead and finish it up if I had the board. These can be rather frustrating when you first start working with them, but once you get used to that method of doing it, it works really well. The glue and water idea is, as you can see, it makes it just as hard as a rock. You can twist them or bend them, they just won't come apart. Some of the models that you get nowadays, for instance, the Constitution from all the shipways has laser cut hatch. So you still have to make the frame, but this is already laser cut in a piece of wood. They look pretty classy, but these don't look too bad either. Another little side note, on your lower decks where you didn't have any cannon, they would have had a solid hatch, and also a hatch on the main deck that was actually a hatch for loading or offloading supplies would have been a solid hatch. But in any situation where you had guns below the deck that the hatch is in, you're going to have a grating hatch for gun smoke reasons, ventilation purposes. And they had covers that they put over those when they were at sea in rough water and so forth.
Very cool.